Okay, so we're going to talk about War and Peace, or War and Pieces as I used to call it. I'm going to focus on this, the new edition, which is largely the same game as the original edition. Few modifications here and there, mainly to the campaign game. I don't know, a little bit to the way some of the terrain works. There's new terrain types, and the map's been redone, and I think that's actually a positive in some ways. What I found myself doing, though, was in order to play the game, because of various component issues, I ended up playing with the after starting with the new version, I ended up swapping over almost entirely to the old edition, just because the components were more playable for me. And we'll talk about those differences. Well, I talked about that. I posted something over on the old War and Peace, just to give a quick comparison of some of those. That's also linked in my coverage of this. I'm not going to cover the old game at all on its own, because although I may mention a few things about it, where this is actually made some modifications that are positive, but also with the components where I feel like they went negative in certain ways. Since the components are such a big deal with this, I'm going to hit on that first, I think. Because other issues, I feel, I don't know, require a different kind of analysis. Let me just put that aside. I don't need it. Okay. So, the first thing is the map of the new version, and it comes in 2 pieces instead of 4, and is really beautiful in appearance. It includes different terrains. One of the big upgrades for it is the rivers are on the hex sides, which makes the game much easier to play on that. It has little bridges which negate the river for movement purposes, which is pretty significant. It also has a high mountain terrain as well as a lower mountain terrain, giving differences in the movement costs for those. There may be some other issues with it, some other changes as well. Overall, I think the new map is actually fantastic, but for one thing, and this is why I got rid of the new map. The old map has a much, much smaller footprint. Now, the reason that the new map takes up, I don't know, about twice as much space, is they put all kind of charts and tables, all kind of charts on it, well, all kind of holding boxes and charts and stuff like that on it, that used to be contained on player aids in the original game. They changed the perspective of the European map so that it includes a little bit more territory. More of Sweden's in there, Naples, the whole Italian boot is in there. I think Sicily's even on there, and Malta. But and then they also added this little commerce rating thing, which could have been on a player aid, and they added, let's see if I can find it, somewhere over here, yeah, we got a hint of it here. Let's see if we can get it out. They added this kind of stuff that's only used in the Egyptian campaign. Again, that could have been put on a separate piece of board or something, you know, whatever. And what ended up happening is, if I have the option to play a game that I can fit on one table, you know, like the old War and Peace was, much more easily, I'm going to do that if I can. Now, that was the big thing, because this is a game where you're looking at a lot of things very briefly. And I found myself really not liking how much I had to walk around this huge map, how much I couldn't reach things. Look, I play big monsters, bigger things than this. It's not outside my realm to play on such a large map. I think I might have, like, I feel like maybe I made a mistake in swapping to the smaller map, but honestly, the big map was a fair part of why I was not coming up here playing as often. Maybe I could have coped with that, but once I had already broken into the War and Peace for the pieces, the old War and Peace, I was like, fuck it. I might as well use that little map so that I don't have to, really walk around a very large table space. And it was just kind of obnoxious because unlike, I don't know, I was going to say, so unlike something like DAC, where those big operational games or the big tactical games where almost all the activity's happening in one area of the map, this is one where you have to do a lot of little stuff all over the place all the time. You could argue the same thing is true with, like the big World War I or II grand campaign type things. And their maps don't tend to be as big as this one was. Like, I'm trying to think about things like Whiff and stuff. I don't know. I feel like I was forced. Whiff is weird because there's extensions and everything. So I'm, looking at like, I wanted to hold this off, but I'm looking at like Advanced Third Reich. But I remember being upset that I had lost my Third Reich, my original Third Reich, and I ended up picking up another copy of it. Because I kept thinking to myself, I'd kind of like to play Advanced Third Reich's rules on that original little map. Again, because this huge, beautiful map that Advanced Third Reich came with, and A World at War as well, just ate up too much space, increased the amount of time and effort, especially as a solitaire player, and decreased my total enjoyment compared to being able to manipulate all the pieces where they're kind of simple to see in front of me. And the weird thing is, so Advanced Third Reich has kind of a reason for it. They made the hexes bigger, which a lot of people like. I'm okay with whatever. This thing, they didn't really change anything except adding a little bit of territory, most of which doesn't really come into play. Like I said, Sweden, and so that the Russians can actually walk to Sweden through Finland, which might be important. And then a little bit of southern Italy. And it just didn't seem worth it. But on the other hand, the original game had rivers running through the center of hexes, which is just, it caused the way you have to cordon and stuff like that behind the river not making sense. If you're in the river hex, you're always on the wrong side of the river from your point of view, and the right side of the river from the enemy point of view, which kind of feels like it defeats the purpose of being on the river hex. But what could you do, you know? Whereas rivers as a barrier to both sides makes a lot more sense, at least to me. Someone tried to come up with an argument against it. I don't buy it. So that's the map. The map's kind of, I would say, still overall a plus. But then we come to the counters. And the counters, you know, they're glossy, they're double-sided, which could help. I don't know how many counters they gave in this. I think it's less than in the original. But they made a couple of choices with the information to put on the counters. And if you look at my video comparing the two games component-wise, I show that more clearly where I've got everything out. But quite simply, I found these counters almost impossible to cope with. Now, I've been told that the 7th edition, this is the 6th edition by One Small Step, which appears to be a horrible company. They didn't even answer my email because I have a page from the absolutely new game that was just absolutely missing. And, you know, they didn't even answer it with, hey, we've got an online copy of the rules. They just have no one on their customer service, I'm guessing, or whatever. You know, I mean, I don't know. Someone else was able to point me to that. That's great. The new counters look pretty. They look more modern. That's great. The little pictures of the men on them are prettier. They look like a more modern version. They look like GMT type quality counters. The problem is they take up a little bit more of the real estate on the counter. And they don't really convey any additional information. And in fact, they convey it in a little bit less visibly, like, striking manner. The old counters look like they're from 1970s. And they're close enough. Like this, okay? They have a smaller figure on them. It is immediately obvious what it is. You're not going to get confused between an infantry, a leader, and a cavalry. They're all absolutely clean cut. The leaders are particularly problematic because they put faces on them, but they put the same fucking face on everything, you know? Whereas the old leaders just had a little flag symbol, tiny little symbol. Again, not absolutely tiny, but there were 3 kinds of images. There was all monochrome, there was the flag, there was a horseman, and there was an infantryman. And that's it. And that's all you need. And because there's not any additional information portrayed on that greater picture. I don't feel like strategic games are ones where I really, really need to see a guy in a uniform, particularly. I'm okay with it if it's not cluttering the counter too much. But here it is, unfortunately. So, they have the strength point of the unit on there. Then they have a letter for the nationality of the unit. Every single unit has this, I think. Wait, maybe not. No. The major powers do not have that. And then they have a letter to indicate the type of unit. Now, this is close to what the old one had. The old one had nationality indicated by a small letter code. Same thing here. But it could be a little bigger because there was more real estate. And it had the number, a little bigger. Not that the number was a problem on these. That's nice and bold. They didn't have a letter for infantry or for cavalry. You can tell that by the image on the counter real clearly. It's harder on these. Maybe that's why they put it there. Which meant that if there was a letter for the type of unit, first of all, the only types of units that had that letter were units that were major power units. So they didn't have a minor power code on them. So there's room for either the type or the minor power code, and it can be, twice as big, i.e. readable. I find these counters, the indication of what type of unit it is and what nationality it was, absolutely unreadable. That's for a number of reasons. One is the amount of real estate that they've already eaten up with the figure, and then adding more more spaces that get filled up on the counter. So they decided to make things, I guess, a little easier. Maybe, I don't know, by taking up more of the real estate with a tiny little flag in the corner of each unit. So now, what used to be on the old counters, there was a very easy way to tell. First of all, is this a major power counter, or is it a minor power, a minor allies counter? The minor allies counters were printed with a gold on them for the figure and for the lettering and numbers and all. So very quickly, that information just comes to you immediately. That also tells you the morale of the unit, which is additionally represented, again, using up more of this almost non-existent real estate. You can't even see this, but there's basically above the flag a number of little dots. So they're trying to convey all this information. And I found, even with my better glasses, although these aren't absolutely up to date, I'm sure, since they're a few years old and I just started wearing them last year at the end. They're trying to convey all this additional information, sometimes duplicating it, as with the flag and the nationality on the minor power things. And all of it is so much less capable of conveying any information. Look, if you've got fantastic eyes or a magnifying glass, you can see what's going on here. But if you've got to throw a magnifying glass in, I don't think that simplifies play. It adds a hindrance to how you're going to play it. They also included counters in here that I can't figure out what their purpose is for. I ended up using them for things because there weren't counters to handle those things necessarily, I think. I don't know. Like per nation city points for nations that don't track that individually by the rules. Shit like that. I don't know. Anyway, the counters were the biggest problem in terms of component quality. Dice, they're okay. Too big for my taste. I'll put them in my bucket of other too big dice. I got plenty of dice. I'm not going to complain too much. It's cool they added dice. That's all I can say. There's nothing terrible about them. They look like they're quality dice. The rule book, it is written in the same style as the original rules. A lot of it is just copy and paste. This is problematic. The original rules were not well written. And I mean, not like they were horrible, but they were difficult to discover what you needed to find out. They're written in a weird sort of style that nothing else was using. Avalon Hill was weird because they put out different formats of rules all over the place. So you never could count on. Yeah, it wasn't like SPI or even companies whose rules I didn't like particularly, like Quinto or GDW or something like that. They just kept trying different styles. Well, this one feels like the designer laid out his own rules the way he wanted them. And maybe just was like, no, you're not going to rework these. They go like this, or I guess I don't publish a game. I don't know. I mean, he must have made decent money off of this. This is back when games printed a ton of stuff. So I don't know. I'm not a fan of most Avalon Hill rules, so I'm not sure. These might actually be better than most of them. But the weird formatting of using a letter for sections instead of a number, and the numbers underneath that didn't really work. It has a tendency to feel like a wall of text everywhere. Of course, the new version is on glossy paper, which is problematic because if you want to make any corrections or anything, you can't really write on it. And then they don't even use the back page. I guess you could write lots of notes on here or something if you're willing to do it in, permanent marker or something, but it won't take pencil well, I'm sure. And, they waste a page here on a picture. I don't know, just things could have been done differently to lay out the rules a little bit better. There's a lot of full color pictures in it. I don't think there were as many there certainly weren't full color pictures, like this, but I think color was used in the rules, and there were images, so some of those have been repeated. The scenario book, same kind of situation. This didn't exist before. Everything was in the rule book before. It's kind of nice having them in separate things, I guess. Again, they're like the original. There's more scenarios, a few new ones. I don't feel like they're the meat of the game, even though there's kind of a semi-operational feel to the game. To me, this has always been about the grand campaign. I view the scenarios as kind of learning type things, kind of like Europa Universalis, where it's like, okay, I played a couple of scenarios, now I'm ready for the campaign, and I never really want to play the scenarios again, which makes it particularly odd, from my point of view at least, that oh look, they've added, most poignantly, they've added this sort of Egyptian campaign map and scenario in it when the grand campaign doesn't include that. And it's not like they have a lot of revolutionary scenarios. Not Nations in Arms actually had 2 campaigns, right? Am I right there? I think that's the case. I think it had it had multiple campaigns, but some of them were relatively short. But yeah, this doesn't do that. It gives you, unlike the original version, a couple of Italian a couple of Italian wars that you get to play out, and then it gives you the Egyptian invasion, and everything has Napoleon in it. Some of the new counters are for kind of crappy Revolutionary era leaders. They're not all crappy, but whatever. And yeah, that's something else that was added to the game. So they added additional what are unnamed leaders that are supposed to be sort of generic staff and whatever, but they added ones that have a command value. The original game just had those as zeros. They were really replacement leaders. They help you move your troops around. Now you've got ones that are better than some of the actual named leaders in the game. Now that might be reasonable. You might say, well, some of those named leaders are pretty bad. Yeah, but what it means is you basically have an immortal replacement leader who can who's reasonable quality. Anyway, have this forceful display. This is similar to the original game. I found the original one easier to read for whatever reason, maybe because of the gloss. This one gives more room to the major powers, I think, by a little bit. I don't know. And less room to the minor powers. I don't know that that's bad or anything. It seems to work fine. We had a number of leader displays. Now, technically, these are an advantage. First of all, there was a similar leader display in the original game, but it had the problem of everybody was on the same leader display, which really kind of doesn't work, especially if you're playing with a fog of war type thing. If you're playing a multiplayer, or even a two-player game, if you're not playing solo, it's kind of important that you have one player has theirs, the other player has theirs. There's a little bit of an issue with that, which they resolved here, which is, hey, look, the French might control the Austrians, the Prussians, the Spaniards. They might control the Russians too, but whatever. Actually, that's impossible. It's impossible under the new rules. It was possible in the old ones. And that way, you've got your own sheets for each player individually. I used the old game ones because I'm playing solo, and they're actually more convenient solo. Map size probably wouldn't be as big a difference, wouldn't be as big a problem playing, especially multiplayer, although the French player does have to get around everywhere. A single fold-out player aid with all the charts that are needed. The fact that this is fold-out is kind of painful, because sometimes you have to shift around. I had issues finding things where they are. The fact that there's only one is kind of painful if you're playing multiplayer. I mean, this game could be played 5-player. The original held 6. They got rid of Spain as a player for various reasons. This has optional and non-optional stuff on it. It's really kind of necessary, but again, I found the way the charts were presented in the original game to be more useful, even though there's more stuff on here. Some of that stuff isn't really necessary. For example, there's an optional combat system where basically both sides are rolling the dice on the same combat table, and they created a whole chart that replicates the original combat table, and I guess maybe kind of makes it easier. I'm not sure. I saw no point to it at all. Anyway. And then we have the Grand Campaign, which this is where I had a problem, because a couple of pages are missing from mine right from the beginning. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Yeah, one sheet, basically 4 pages, was just missing from my rule book. Never got stapled in or whatever, and that sucks. The portions of the rules that are missing, well, first of all, there is a PDF online. I read through that. Most of the portions of the rules that are missing are from the original game, that were missing for me, or from the original game, so I didn't have too horrible a problem once I downloaded and looked at the PDF. Other stuff I actually just didn't use. It wasn't, there's like the invasion of Ireland was on there. I think something else was on there too. I ended up saying screw it. If I decided to go along with using, with making that invasion, I would have. That's another thing you can do that's added in the game. You didn't used to be able to invade Ireland. There's no reason I can see that you would want to. And then there's this. I think I read this online before the game came out, even before the new edition came out. This is basically the original designer, McLaughlin, didn't exactly wash his hands, I think, of it, but this other guy, John W. Gant, took over the redesign of the game, which isn't a huge redesign. It's mostly the same game. But he took over the redesign issues, and this is like called the 6th edition, Well, editions 2 through 5 never were published. They may have been kicking around as some kind of print and play or something. Certainly once the map starts changing, that becomes harder and harder. But this Gant guy ends up doing all the work, being the design work on it, or doing the majority of it from what I can tell. We'll get to that sheet I showed you before. He's also developer, project manager, and editor. Now, and listed with the playtest map, but whatever. Look, project manager, what the fuck? That's basically developer, isn't it? But what it means is that the new part of the design essentially was done by him, perhaps run through in some sort of very light form with McLaughlin, but it's Gant who's on there as developer. So it is his final decision as far as I'm concerned, right? And it's a really horrible idea to have a game designer and developer be the same person. I've gone into that so many times. You need a developer. The developer is there to represent the customer's interests and the company's interests, and to make sure that the design isn't going to blow back, that the customer's not going to hate the game, that the company is not going to have its reputation harmed by a bad game. It's that simple. And if you're too close to the design, you're in love with it and everything, and you're not going to be able to see, you're not going to be able to be the guy who says, yeah, that's not really working. You might end up disregarding some playtest responses that you get. All kind of stuff like that. You really need the developer to be the advocate for not just the designer's view of what should happen. But anyway. So what's weird about this thing, when I first saw it online, it gives you some discussions of how you should deploy your troops to utilize them properly in War and Peace. Well, it doesn't follow the rules. It doesn't follow the rules of the original game, and it doesn't follow the rules of the new edition. It has units spaced out too far to actually support each other. I don't know what this is about, but whatever it was, when I first saw it, I said, this doesn't work. When I looked at it here, I'm like, oh, that's interesting and everything. The rules haven't changed. It still doesn't work. And you really need your units all within 1 hex of each other in order to support one another. And that's not what he at all is trying to, manages to express with this. So it's like, he's got things like 2 hexes apart, and they can't help each other with that. So maybe at some point, there was some other view in play, but it's not War and Peace, and it's actually not realistic because the hexes are, a lot of terrain is covered in them. Now we're going to start dissecting the rules a little bit in terms of, I guess, sort of what the game gets right and what it doesn't. There's no index in this one, but there is a table of contents, which is helpful. It's right on the front. That's not a bad place for it. If you have to flip a page to look and then flip more pages, it's a pain in the ass. Okay. The core sequence of play, and I'm going to use the player aid to help me a little bit here so that I don't have to page through this. In the base, so here's the thing. The rules for the base game, the campaign game, did I talk about that at all? I know I had it in front of me for a little bit. Yeah, I talked about it a little bit. The campaign game rules change like the sequence of play. I'm going to talk to you about the campaign game rules. So, and they're more extensive because you have production and all that in it. But basically, all the neutral players go, the neutral players go first. And their turn is sort of a simplified one. They're able to move their boats around. They get a production phase, then they can move their units around. For some reason, there's a supply check in there. I don't know why, because they don't need supplies for anything. And then they can make changes to alliances. And that sounds like I have my heat on, which means it's been on for days. Whenever I turn it on up here, I forget about it because, yeah. Okay. I had the doors open and everything today. Of course, it was too hot for it to kick on. But then you have a more detailed pro-French player segment. All the players who are aligned. So, yeah, I have to discuss this now, I guess. The way the Grand Campaign, and this is true with both games, everything, unless I point out otherwise, assume everything's true with both games. You are either aligned as pro-French or anti-French, or neutral. If you want to fight a war, you have to align with either the pro-French or the anti-French. If one of these sides attacks you, you automatically align with the other side, which has some implications. So you can't have like a situation, I don't know. I can think of some kinds of weird and perverse situations, especially like, I'll take an Empires in Arms example. Turkey might be at war with both Russia and Austria, but Austria might be allied to France, something like that. What it also means is, because of the way the conquest rules work, no one can attack you after you've just been defeated in a war, which might be the best time to attack. But this really is a two-sided game. It's designed, I think, to be a two-player game from the beginning. And then the multiplayer rules were sort of tacked on because they always felt funny. And with the scripting that's going on in the Grand Campaign in the new version, it especially seems more like a two-player game. Anyway, in the pro and anti-French player segments, you start with a naval phase. Now you get something new. You get an attrition phase. If you're at war or aligned, you have to roll a die, and all your units suffer attrition based on that. The heavier, well, anyway, we'll get to the attrition rule in a bit. Then you have the alliance phase. Now, if you're a player, when you hit alliance phase, either neutral or otherwise, you get to declare that you're shifting alliances by a space. If there are non-player countries in the game, and there always will be because Spain sort of is, you might have a particular alliance might have the capability to roll a die and try to influence them. The situation that's happening in the game, how well you're doing in terms of how many countries are aligned with you, what you've captured, sometimes winning battles. In the campaign game, winning battles against Napoleon is the only ones that count. You get modifiers to that die. But what that means is one side or the other is capable of gaining allies if they're available. Or pulling an enemy out of the enemy camp into the neutral camp. This is the same system that was used in the original game. And my belief in the original game, what it ends up meaning is that France can kind of lock the other major powers out of being able to ever oppose them in the two-player version or whatever. In this game, there's some scripting to prevent that, I think. The rules on that are kind of convoluted. So were some of the rules in the original. Like some of the naval rules were kind of poorly presented and didn't really make much sense. Those have been copied over into this. Trying to think if there's anything else. Maybe the conquest rules. I know when I dig into any of the rules, it's a lot of work to figure out what the fuck is actually going on in these. They're not well written, is kind of my issue. The presentation isn't that horrible. It's more the writing, and that's carried over, where it's just not as clear in terms of what's going on. I think I also found some ambiguities or contradictions, but I don't really remember. It's been a while since I read the rules. Look at my intro, you'll see if I picked any of those up when I'm doing the read-through, the fine-tooth combing of the rules. Yeah. Okay. Then you hit a production phase. This works the same as it does with the neutral players. Each country here, though, rolls their own production die roll, and they might... Basically, you have a chance of getting double production, is all that what you use the die roll for. Then you have movement, combat, and then you go to the next player turn. Once all the players have gone, the month moves. I think I'm going to need to swap batteries, and I don't want to turn around because I'm wearing my assless chaps now. These sweats have a fucking huge gaping hole in the back. You needed to know that. All right, so I'm going to go down to investigating individual rules, but I don't really feel like continuing straight through. I'm tired. Don't usually take a break like that in the midst of my reviews, but I don't know. I just felt I needed to. Okay. Attrition in the game is handled per side for the warring countries. And basically they roll a single die, and that applies to everything on that side, modified by the situations of the units. Usually that works pretty well. It's certainly better than what I used to do, which was roll for each unit or each stack, which was just tedious and painful. Also, it may... I'm sorry, I'm looking at an advert on the box that I didn't know was there. It's also probably more realistic because, at least in a given theater, attrition is probably relatively well spread out, in the sense that, like, the supply lines are either functioning or not, the weather is particularly bad or it's not, whatever. So I'm cool with that. It can be a little painful, but just because you're having to assess each unit's, each stack's individual circumstances in some cases, but usually it's pretty standardized. The alliance system. So in most of the games, including the two-player campaign, you use this die roll modified by the circumstances that the success that you're currently undergoing. This creates sort of a snowball effect, which is different from how the multiplayer alliance system works, where nations kind of, I assume, it's hard to tell how bad the scripting is in the campaign rules. This is one place where it's kind of vague. In the original game, countries were just able to make their alliance, join wars when they wanted to. They were out for a year when they got knocked out and defeated. They had to remain neutral, thus they couldn't be attacked by anyone, couldn't attack anyone. The scripting rules in the Grand Campaign changed that significantly, in the sense that it looks like, it's just hard to tell how they should be interpreted. For at least I couldn't really fully tell what was intended, whether they were intended to, because again, it feels like it's written for the two-player game, which automatically causes certain things to happen. And so, like, Austria has to join the war once they rebuild their forces. Well, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that in the multiplayer game, if there's an Austrian player, they don't have any free will in the matter? And I made my own modifications to that, which I'm relatively happy with, which preserves somewhere between, the case, which is that they're actually free to declare war without their full force pool in play and that they're free to not necessarily go anti-French, which they would be forced to under the scripting as well. It's important in the two-player game because otherwise Austria could be kept, after their first defeat, out of the war permanently and constantly maybe be a French ally. The actual movement system, pretty standard. You've got overruns present in it. You don't have zones of control or anything like that, so you can kind of bypass units, and it makes sense. It's just, it feels, I don't know, it's very, I don't know how to put it. It feels like you want a huge stack of units so that you can overrun enemy stacks, and later when we get to combat, so that you can engage right away with everything that you have without having to reinforce. But the attrition rules make that less viable. Now the problem, because you don't want big stacks during the attrition phase. But the thing is, if you win a combat or lose a combat, if you have the opportunity to advance, you can basically split your force in two and send, or more if it's a multi-hex combat, and send your advancing units forward so that you can avoid the attrition check. If you lose a combat, you can split your forces up on the withdrawal and, again, avoid the attrition penalty. So you kind of want to consolidate your forces for the attack and then disperse them after the attack so that you don't face the attrition. It ends up, what that means though is that the defender, because they're waiting, they're expecting the attrition roll next, is constantly got less, they've got their troops in that spread out format, while the attacker has every reason to consolidate. And if the defender decides to consolidate, they'll start taking really prohibitive attrition losses. This would all be terrible if combat were resolved on a single die roll. But when you get to combat, what you can do is after you fight one round, you can start bringing reinforcements in. The problem is, if the enemy can get to 4-1, they can overrun you, which doesn't necessarily allow them to split their forces out. That's if they have to have movement points remaining to do that. Or B, they can get sort of an automatic success of maximal quality, which is a D3 and a sort of a 1. The overrun will just destroy the enemy. The D3 won't, but it layers levels of demoralization on the enemy. Now, demoralization levels, once you take enough demoralization levels, I'm trying to think, I don't know what's optional and what's not is my problem. I know what I played with. Yeah, okay. So in the base game, once you take enough demoralization levels that you have a morale of 0, you must leave the battle. What that means is, if you get hit, by a good die roll, and you're probably outnumbered, or you get one of these maximal results, and it may not take much of a good die roll because some of the nations only have a morale of 1, you end up in a situation in the base game where you have to retreat. You're out of the battle. If you're playing with the demoralization advanced rules, that means you could continue fighting, but if you do and you don't get reinforced with sufficient forces to match what you've got, which will rally your demoralization, you lose basically a die roll of units to capture each turn, which is terrible. Okay, so, and reinforcing requires that you roll a 5 or a 6 modified by the leadership value. Most leaders are value 1. There are some 0s, there are some 2s. That means you have at best a 50-50 chance of any stack adjacent to you being able to reinforce or adjacent to the enemy. Quite often the enemy isn't going to move in to a place where he's surrounded by your pieces. He's going to pick at the edges, which means you probably have like a 50-50 chance. So most battles end up with the side that's losing just saying, yeah, I don't really want to fight this, and withdrawing. There's a possible penalty to that because, and again, I think this is an optional rule where maybe I'm mistaken. No, it's not optional. If the opponent has more cav than you do, you lose an extra strength point. I complained early on that the battles weren't decisive enough, but honestly, I think they are. I think they do actually capture across the board most of what Napoleonic battles were like. You might have smaller battles that, don't really get covered in the history or whatnot. And you're looking at a turn that's a month long. Now, this is what's kind of weird. Because all the battles happen simultaneously on a given month. And you resolve the first round of all battles at the same time, then you resolve the second round of all battles at the same time. And there's some capability where units that were in one battle could end up out of it and then join a different battle and everything. All that makes sense within the month's time for, if there aren't two battles happening near each other. But if there are two battles happening near each other, basically what you're saying is they automatically happen on the same day, or days. And that feels really kind of weird to me. The scale of the game doesn't really match the interactive mechanisms of the combat system. Unlike Nations in Arms, there is a lot of room for you to make certain tactical choices as to how you disposition your forces. But again, it's always in favor of the attacker. Entrenchments are a way for the defender to kind of improve on that. And I mean, I don't think they're entrenchments. I mean, sure, troops would dig in sometimes here and there, but for the most part, I think it's more of an improved positioning, forcing the attack to happen, in better terrain and some entrenchment perhaps, or some fortification of specific locations. But I think it's got more to do with just positioning yourself. I don't know. They call it entrenchments. It doesn't really feel like that's all it would be. But Empires in Arms and most of the Napoleonic games that I've seen that are strategic use an area combat or a point-to-point type system, which works fine because you're not relying, battles happen all in one area and they combine, and there's a lot of abstraction going on. That may be multiple battles happening, whatever. Nations in Arms doesn't have this complex system of reinforcement and whatnot that this game uses, which makes it kind of feel like it's an area combat type situation, except spread out over a hex map, which makes it more complicated to move and manipulate your forces. This is very complicated to move and manipulate your forces appropriately, and especially because of the supply rules, which I'll get back to in a moment. But the combat, the fact that they're all happening at the same time so that they can end up supporting each other and everything, it's just kind of weird. The fact that only one battle is sort of happening between any two forces in a given month, it all feels kind of weird to me. The actual combat resolution this is the second combat table that basically, gotta find it, I wasn't using it, basically matches this one. And essentially you have very limited odds effects, 1-to-1, 3-to-2, 2-to-1, always rounded against the larger side. So it's not giving a defensive advantage right away, automatically. And I guess beyond that you have 4-to-1, which triggers either overruns or automatic good results. The die rolls are modified mainly by leadership, unit morale, we'll get into that in a bit, and terrain. And in the base game, you simply roll a couple of dice and you get one of, 11 results? Yeah, 11 different results that's possible on the curve, whatnot. There's an option where you roll dice for both sides using the same modifiers and the same level, where for the smaller force it's bad for them to roll high, which feels weird, but that's fine. And you get results that are anywhere from nothing happens to a 1, which just does some damage, and you have to look that up based on the size of the smaller force in the battle, up to a D3, which do increasing amounts of damage, although D1 and D2 do the same damage always. And the D result lowers a force's morale by that many levels. Now, the morale hits affect you. You might either automatically lose the battle or have the risk of desertions or surrenders. And the actual damage in a battle feels relatively low. I mean, like a force of 50,000 men for the smaller force is not, in one round of battle, is going to cause a maximum of 15,000 casualties to a side. That's pretty big, but yeah, I don't know. It's really kind of this balancing between the attrition losses you're going to take and the battle losses as to how big your forces might want to be and what you want to think about. The bigger your force, though, is, the more opportunity you have to take bigger losses. Although that does max out. The table maxes out at 21, and you don't end up, getting additional casualties for a much larger battle. That 21, that's, armies over 100,000 men as the smaller army. So that's really at the ridiculously large level. Let me hit on the options. So some of what I felt with the battles in the basic roles is that they just didn't feel all that decisive. The losses, I'm starting to come into an agreement that, okay, they're more in line than I thought they were. Quite often each side is only losing one strength point, but that's like 5,000 men still. So, yeah, for some skirmishing and whatnot, sure, whatever. Not necessarily in a single battle, but over the course of the month, right? But one thing is, it almost always would behoove the defender to just fall back, because then they can take the advantage of being the attacker coming back and get a better odds result. Things are modified by the quality of the troops, the terrain, whether you're entrenched, all kind of stuff like that. I tended not to hit entrenched units, just because you could usually find something that wasn't. And you can't really cordon off a big section of the board, because then your troop strength will be too low and you'll just get overrun. But there are a couple of options that affect that decisiveness. I was going to use both of them. One is this tactical matrix, which, if you're familiar with 1776, is very similar to that. Basically, each player picks a chit. That chit gives a plus or minus to one side or the other. They're not exactly the same options, so you don't have like refuse left flank, refuse right flank, or whatever. You have an envelop result, whatever. And it didn't work very well solo, and I decided to put it aside. But what it does that's good, in my opinion, is if you want to leave a battle, you have to pick the withdraw chit. You're not allowed to otherwise. Now, whether or not, here's where things get ambiguous, and old rules, new rules, same stuff. It's not clear whether or not that withdrawal, using this, means that you still get the automatic withdrawal if you're defeated, like if you're demoralized, or if you're stuck having to keep fighting and surrender. If it's the latter, which is what I played it as, maybe it leans in that direction, I'm not sure, then the defender more or less has to pick withdrawal if they're facing an iffy, a battle they don't really feel like they've got a good chance at. And the attacker knows that the defender has to pick it and picks the best thing against that, which is charge. Now, there's a little bit of fuzziness in there. You could try to, bluff a little bit or whatever, especially if you're using the full fog of war. I feel like games that use full fog of war are unrealistic, though. Like, you should know mostly what you're facing, certainly by the day of the battle. The other option is to use persistent, and I tried using both, to use persistent demoralization levels. The persistent demoralization levels if you take a D result, you don't recover from it immediately. Now, I felt like those were a little too harsh. Basically, you roll a couple of dice. I think you have to break a 9. Each point you get over 9 on the pair of dice allows you to drop your demoralization level by 1. You get to add your leadership value for the stack, and you get to add your morale of the stack, which could be up to a +4, giving better leaders with Russian or French troops a good chance of clearing their entire morale issue. Each point so if you succeed in the core of the rules, I think what happens is you lose 1 demoralization step. That felt way too harsh for me. So what I did was I said I wanted to put it so that for each point that you're over, you get to remove a demoralization step. And that meant that you're able to conceivably recover from a D3 in one month, which feels proper. Honestly, the whole demoralization feels a little bit too extreme even with that, but it does at least provide some level of decisiveness to these battles. So it's not just a matter of, under the base rules, you take a hit, you withdraw, you take whatever your hit is, you withdraw, you recover completely from your morale, and then you hit back on your turn that month, because there's advantages to being the attacker. Your troops won't be as spread out, and if you have your troops spread out, you'll end up taking more attrition, and the game actually is sort of this management of no, I'm not finding the word, so I'll just use attrition again. The attrition of your forces through both combat and your attrition check. I kind of liked how it worked. It forced enemies to withdraw if they couldn't recover their morale. There is one problem with it, which is under the original rules, a D1 through D3 all makes perfect sense, right? We're just getting my morale down to 0. What doesn't make sense in this extended, and what isn't explained very well, and again, like the naval rules, this is in the original game. There's just certain areas of it where it's like you're left. Make some shit up because it's the only way it's going to work. The rules don't explain it fully, and it carries over into this new version as well. At least this 6th edition. Again, I don't know whether 7th edition got any better. But what's not clear with this option is whether or not you can accumulate more than a D3. I said no, because that'll matter for your overall recovery. And because let's say I get a D2 the first time and a D3 the second, now I'm at D5. I'm in trouble with that if I do that, but anyway. Because in the original, it was just, look, your D just goes away after the battle, so it doesn't really matter. Well, it goes away after all the battles of the turn, so it really just doesn't matter. You're not gonna commit that force again. Whereas in in the new one, with this optional rule in play, it's just not clear whether they accumulate or not. Normally they would accumulate, but the question is whether they accumulate beyond D3. And I decided no, that just doesn't make any sense. Now, in the original, D3 is almost meaningless. It causes more casualties. That's one thing. But a force will almost never have a 3 morale. The only things that have a 3 morale are guard units. And the majority of the units in your force would have to be guard units for you to have a 3 morale. This is why I wanted to talk to you a little bit about morale. Different nations have different morales. It's fine. But basically, France, Britain, and Russia have a 2 morale. Every other major power and every minor power has a 1 morale for their regular units. There are a few special guard things. They hardly ever will come into any value unless you are using guard. So for the Russian guard, if you're using guard as your entire stack or the majority of your stack, it means you have a very small force. So what it means is the Imperial Guard is only useful to you when it's in a tiny force, which is just not how it was used. It's the Imperial Guard. It's with the Tsar. It should be with the main army. We go with the French. The same rules apply unless you're playing with an optional rule, which is the Imperial Guard commitment, which allows you to boost your morale for a round of combat. But then you have to take your casualties all on the guard. And I don't know, there was more to it. I just never did it. And you have to have Napoleon present for that to even work. And it's a pretty iffy thing, right? You end up, I don't remember what it is. I'm trying to remember. Let's take a look. It's done by the round. All losses have to be taken by guards. If the the penalty with that is that if the French force is demoralized, its morale value is automatically reduced to 0. I think I had trouble with that when I was reading the rules. I think I understand it now. Now, demoralized in the rules means your morale has hit 0. So it's saying if the French force gets a morale of 0, it has a morale of 0, which is meaningless. Yeah, that's a tautology. Okay, great. Doesn't add anything. But I don't think that's what's meant here. I think it's meant if it gets any D result, the whole force is now morale 0. Now, again, if you're playing with that option, the option on the persistent morale losses, the two kind of don't fit. You're going to have to, again, bridge the gap there and say, okay, well, it gives you a D3 or something like that, instead of a D1. Anyway. Another factor that affects both combat and your attrition is the supply rules. Your strength in combat is halved if you're attacking while out of supply. So you have to set your supply lines up if you're going to make any combat. Your attrition rolls are badly penalized. It's just a +1, but it's horrible if you're out of supply when you come to the attrition phase. Strangely, I don't think these were in the original. Maybe I'm wrong. But the new game has out of supply markers, which serve no purpose. I think I had this problem with nations in arms too. I can't read these. They have entrenchments. They have forts. I think those are out of supplies. I can't tell. There's something here that's just unreadable to me. Oh no, those are the tactical chits, I think. Yeah, I don't think they had out of supply markers, but they added out of supply markers, but they serve no purpose except maybe as a mnemonic device, But you check supply at the time that you need to check it, right? Like at the moment of a battle or during the attrition phase. Kind of helpful, but the real problem is maintaining your supply lines is a bitch in this game. I forgot to mention something. I think I hinted at it, but I didn't actually state it outright. In order to move infantry in this game, you need a leader. And the leader can only move the infantry with its early movement points. So you can't run up, grab some forces, move them around, go back, grab some other forces, move them around, all kind of stuff that would feel pretty weird. Although it might be arguable, but I don't know. So basically, you can't just spread your forces all out and move them. Your cav can do that, your infantry cannot. Anyway, in order to have supply lines, you need to have, going back to your supply source, and those are a multitude of different things. Home country, major cities, capitals of minor powers that are allied to you, and major cities in conquered countries. I think are all the ones. But you have to be able to trace from them, and your line of supply traces 3 movement points, and any kind of unit can extend the supply line. Anyway, what it ends up being is that it's a pain in the ass to arrange and maintain all your supply lines. And honestly, the new map makes that easier with the way the rivers are and with bridges on them. The old game, I started having real bigger problems, or that sounds horrible, much larger problems with maintaining and continuously setting up my supply lines to push further, whatever. The danger, of course, with supply lines is anything that's, if you've got like 1-point garrisons all over the place that you're using as your depots, they're very easy to overrun. So a small stack of cav or something might be able to slip behind, cut your supply. You don't need supply as the defending player, though. You get your full strength in that case. And yes, your attrition roll will be a little worse, which will suck. And then as the attacker, you get to set your supply line up. It ends up being a hell of a lot of work to move units because of setting up all your supply lines and trying to figure out, what attacks you're going to make and everything. It is a lot of complexity. But that's why you play this game and not Empires in Arms, is so that you can get into that kind of tactical complexity. I found that it wasn't adding enough to my taste in the situation, but whatever. The fuck is that? Oh, this is a new role. This maneuver sur les derrières. Ah, yes. This is the Boinker Doinker role, isn't it? Yeah. So you have one factor in this. Is it an optional? Yeah, it's an optional. Yeah, so there's a number of little optional rules that allow you to fiddle with the combat bonuses, and one of them is the French only are able to attack a unit from multiple directions, kind of outflanking or whatever, enveloping. Even though there's an envelopment check, this is something different. They get a bonus for the first round of combat, but they've got to make a die roll to bring that into play. that's bonused by the leader trying to join. And then they actually end up stacked in the same hex instead of attacking from different hexes. So it's just really kind of weird there. You have the cav charge. If you have more cav than the enemy, you can get a bonus from that, but at the cost of your losses are going to come off cav. You have the Imperial Guards, which can add to your morale. But you have to take your losses on the Imperial Guard. That's actually worth it, because Imperial Guard is about as expensive as Cav and is less useful overall, because Cav can move on its own. Ooh, I forgot the Russian patriotism rule. It's an optional rule, but I was intending to play with it. The Russian forces should actually have a morale of 3 on the Russian map, which makes them really, really dangerous. There weren't a lot of battles at the very end of my game, but that morale of 3 might have made a big difference, because it came down to a close thing. The Russians were going to lose anyway. There was no question about that. But anyway. They have a fog of war rule where basically you can't look at anything. Again, fog of war rules that are that extreme, I don't feel are realistic. I feel like they're less realistic than you know everything. Because the die rolls, add some uncertainty to the whole world. So what I usually do is just sort of, okay, sometimes I don't pay too much attention and try to figure everything out. But I should know what size army I'm going up against, more or less. Maybe not exactly if I have the odds, but how big it is. I got to swap my battery. I'm going to get to the campaign in a bit then. The biggest reason for getting this new game for me, the new edition, is that the grand campaign in the original War and Peace just didn't work. There are 2 ways to look at it. The 2-player game and the multiplayer game. I look at the full multiplayer and the 2-player. The 2-player, the problem with it was France beats Austria in the Austerlitz, the 1805 beginning. Okay. Austria is now neutral. They're no longer an enemy. That takes one of the points against them. They have Britain, Austria, and Russia are at war with them at the beginning. They have Spain as an ally. There's a chance in that game that Spain could be pulled away from the French right away in the 2-player game. Just because of just because they have the coalition has the advantage right off the bat on the alliance check. But France will probably I don't know if they can grab a city right away. I think they're busy. They're busy in Bavaria, and I don't think they're able to get Innsbruck right away. So after that first couple turns of that scenario, Austria is probably really on the ropes. The Russians are coming up to join them. And production cities start falling, which give the French city points. And now Spain isn't going to leave the war. Prussia's not going to join the war anymore at that point. They might, just by luck, again in the 2-player game. And you might actually be able to peel Russia off the war and just beat Austria. Now you've beaten Austria, you take them down. It's England alone in that case. And as France, you have the bonus and can start bringing Prussia or Russia into alliance with you. And you just get into this position where, the anti-French player can never form another coalition because you've always got the alliance points in your favor. And, Britain alone is not able to do much. The second option in the old game, let's look at the 6-player game. Every player has complete autonomy. For the most part, that means that they want to be anti-French. They have to be anti-French by the end of the game, because if France owns Paris, they win at 1815. Spain being pro-French kind of makes sense because they can go take Portugal, which, you know, whatever. This version tries to fix that with a complex set of scripting, which works perfectly fine in the 2-player game. As I indicated before, though, it's a little ambiguous to me whether that scripting is supposed to be fully in effect in the multiplayer game, in which case, if you're Russia, Austria, or Prussia, you kind of don't get to make any decisions. You don't get to choose when you're going to go to war or anything, until, I guess, when people can roll for your alliance. The rules don't specify that. They're all spoken on to the 2-player game, to the 2-player game essentially, or to the idea that you're not able to, that when restrictions are listed, the lifting is mentioned as, after this, players can roll for alliances normally. There's nothing to align these two things, so it's not even clear to me that the scripting is supposed to be there in the multiplayer game. I just want to catch, we're getting some sunrise in there. But given that the scripting actually let me think. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, I used sort of a hybrid because the scripting is written for the 2-player game, doesn't really make sense in the multiplayer game, but I also felt like certain aspects of it were very important. But I did not take away player autonomy for the most part. Anyway. Instead of what were fairly simple victory conditions that didn't work in the original War and Peace, a whole bunch of stuff has been put into place. And they're a complex list that it's actually really hard to keep in your mind, especially since it's broken up into the 2-player game, victory conditions, 3-player and 4-player game, and then 5-player is basically same as 4-player, except they say some weird things in it. Spain's been dropped as a player. Turkey, they put an extra little map in and everything for Egypt and whatnot. Turkey's not in the game except, as a foreign war kind of event. This is a really cumbersome system that it's hard to get your head around, but maybe you kind of don't really need to, because even though it's a multiplayer game, you've taken away the one guy, Spain, who might actually have a short-term reason to not want to be anti-French. So they might stay neutral, build up their forces and stuff, not commit and all that, but at their heart they know they have to defeat France. There is some possibility that in the original version that a country like Russia or something might want to go to war with Prussia, and no, not with Prussia. Prussia's not worth it for them. They can't take Poland. Unlike, historically, Russia gained Warsaw and much of the Polish territory during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, how did that happen? Well, because France created Warsaw, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and then the Russians conquered it and didn't give it back to Prussia. That works fine in like Empires in Arms. In this game, you can't take it because it's not a production city unless it's, not only, it's not a production city. And there's nothing you can take from Prussia as Russia. I guess you could take like Prague and Innsbruck from the Austrians if you go to war with them, but you probably need a full coalition to win the game. And here there's a series of little special scripted victory conditions that kind of turn out to be you want to own Paris at the end of the game, and you don't want to have lost too badly. But if those all fall through, it falls back to the original game victory conditions, which is how many production cities do you have? Which it's easier for Austria or Prussia to grab German production cities. It's impossible for Spain, basically. All they can get is Portugal. Of course, Spain's not a player in this anymore. Anyway, it's kind of a mess to wrap your head around. I don't feel like it looks like it's fun to try to... You're not going to have the freewheeling diplomacy you have in like Empires in Arms or something. It's not like it felt like it in Nations in Arms either, though, so that's fine. We've already dealt with the campaign game sequence. Naval units are added in the campaign game. Like I mentioned a couple of times, the rules for these are kind of clunky and also not always very clear. But hey, whatever. They've been expanded and made more complicated with a rest of the world commerce map that you're allowed to now sail out in and do commerce raiding with the French. That was actually one of the more exciting things in the game, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. But I actually found that added something when at first I looked at it. I said, why would I want to do this? Well, because France falls behind in Navy, so they can't like invade England, something they'd love to do, could win them the game. But they can handcuff the English with the commerce rating. They will eventually lose the commerce rating war, I think. Although it felt touch and go for a while. But, the Brits were definitely hampered. They had basically their navies had to go out and deal with the commerce rating. They had to use up all their production points for it, and there's just nothing they could do. But far more hindering to the English, maybe, was the American War, which is something that happened from the original game as well and works the same way. It's likely to happen, very likely to happen, early. And it did in this game. The game ended in 1810. Brits were at war with America for a couple of years. I don't know, 1807, 1808, somewhere around there. They went to war. And it's unlikely to end, at least early. Like, you're rolling 2d6 to get a 12 every month to end it. To start it at the beginning of a year, I think it's a 1 in 6 chance. The Russians have similar things with war with Turkey, and then scripted rules for the Swedish war. There's not a hell of a lot else in the Grand Campaign. Oh, production. I've kind of explained that. I don't know. You roll a die for each nation. The nation might get enhanced production, which is doubled. That has to apply to the minor states that are aligned with that nation. because otherwise they can't rebuild their cav. And it's per faction, so pro-French, anti-French. Minor countries, you can only produce with one minor country from each of the different areas that minor countries are in. Now, for the Western and the Eastern Baltic miners, that's not a big deal at all. For the German miners, there are a whole bunch of German states. And I don't know, it just feels kind of shitty, and you have to agree amongst your alliance who's going to get the production. So, like, it's possible Austria will have some German states, and Prussia starts with some, and they'd have to negotiate. England might even have. Russia really wants a German state because they can build Cossacks there, which is goofy. Again, there's additional scripting to prevent. This is what's really fucked up. So, if Austria, Prussia, or Russia is a pro-French power that's not controlled by a player, France gets to use a few of their forces, maybe. But if it's a player is playing that country, they get to use all of their forces. France never gets Expeditionary Corps, and and they can be used like for really massive, ugly purposes. Now, nobody wants France to survive the game in the multiplayer game. You lose if they survive, pretty much. As long as they don't fuck up. So that's the thing. They have to have invaded Spain by a certain date and Russia by a certain date. Or else France can't get the automatic victory for holding Paris at the end of the game. That's part of the scripting. They have specific scripting for a couple of pieces, including the Treaty of Tilsit. Creation of Poland, it's not really clear that there's any advantage to creating the big Poland, the Kingdom of Poland. But you do have the choice between whether you want no Poland or the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. It just keeps Russia out of the war, from returning to the war for longer. Like I said, the commerce rating, that's an optional rule, but that actually added some interesting stuff to me. They have a hidden naval movement rule where, do you have dummies? I think you have dummy fleets even. I found that was just, too much trouble, especially playing solo. They have weather rules. The weather in the original game was very simple. There's like 3 or 4 months of winter, where attrition is higher. Here they've added some complexity, changed different weather zones. You roll dice. They apply to the whole continent. One die applies to the whole continent, but it's modified. And then you look up on a chart. In addition to the normal weather in the winter, they have wet, which reduces your movement by a point for all units, which is kind of painful. But then they have a worse weather form than winter, which is poor. And that comes in the springtime, usually, which was normally good weather. I think it's more accurate. It slows down the ability of the French to move more quickly, so it works pretty well. They have typhus for the Russian invasion. Once you do the Russian invasion, typhus, that may affect everyone's attrition and starts making everything bad. And I felt like that was necessary to get anywhere near the attrition levels that historically happen. All right, so what's my overall on all of this? Look, I've got to change batteries. The first thing is, I ended up taking this whole brand new game and pretty much ditching its components. At the very least, if you don't want to spend for a whole new game and you have the old one, you can certainly get away with the old one. You know, maybe download the rules for this and play the old game with it. That was sort of the summary that came out of my comparison of the two games for components. And a little bit more on the comparison side, I think the scripting makes the game a more interesting two-player game. I think the game has a serious flaw and always has as a big multiplayer game, which is you're really looking at a two-sided game. And like A World in Flames or a Third Reich, you can, have the extra players, but they have to kind of understand they're not really free to make alliances where they want to. They're there to beat France, and that's what they're trying to do. And honestly, the various victory conditions between the different powers that are not France, I would say that they really don't particularly want to exercise any national interests there. They might tweak a little bit if they look at their victory conditions or whatever, but the basic victory conditions is, like in a game of World in Flames, like in a game of Third Reich, let's just take down the enemy. We can judge what the victory was after the fact, but you're not really able to do much to affect whether or not you get to be the victor out of all the coalition players. That's really not something you have a lot of control over, because if there was room for all that kind of jockeying, well, then maybe the two-player game would be too easy, right? The balance of the two games couldn't be the same. Anyway, in terms of whether France wins or loses, you've also got the fact that the two-player game, assuming it was balanced, 50% win by the French, 50% win by the English, would be, now 50% of games are won by the French and, 10% by the English, 10% by the Russians, it's clear that everybody's not going to be equal. And there's no balancing factor in it, like there is in Empire's Arms, which is the bidding system. I think you get mechanisms that give you, because of the scripting, you get mechanisms that give you something more like, I'm not going to say historical results, historical actions by the nations, more than you did in the original game. In the original game, the alliance system just didn't work in the campaign game. So the two-player game was broken in and of itself. The multiplayer worked, but the victory conditions didn't. In this one, the scripting helps you make the two-player game flow with the coalitions forming the way they should. All the same, it's still, I think, France France's game to lose. They really have to work hard to lose it. It just, Spain is possible to take. You jump in there early enough, and you can overwhelm them while you have peace with Austria and Prussia, and while you have an enforced peace with Russia through the Treaty of Tilsit, which is one of the scripting things that isn't in the original game. You would have to. In the original game, you would have to basically garrison the East Front. So again, it's trying to give you the historical flow of things by putting Tilsit in play. But by doing so, it made Spain an easier target to hit because you don't have to defend against possible Russian problems. Once a country's conquered, both sides can kind of move through it. So, well, the conquered player can. I don't know if the conquering player can. I actually don't know if their former allies can continue to move through them. They may have to leave. I don't remember that. It didn't really come up because Tilsit. But anyway. Tilsit gives the French a better opportunity to take Spain early on, and then they can follow the same patterns that they would follow in the old game, which is knock Prussia and Austria out, and then utilize the time afterwards to invade Russia. It's hard to stop the French army. It just is. Historically, Russia didn't stop it. They got to Moscow. Well, the victory conditions that this provides for the French basically involve invading Spain, taking Portugal, they have to hold Amsterdam as well, and then basically garrisoning all the ports, which is trivial to do once you knock out Austria and Prussia, and a few of the ports in Russia, and take Moscow, and it's over. And that's what happened. It feels like the only thing that France historically didn't do in the 1812 version of the war, in the historical 1812 invasion, is that I guess they avoided taking some of the Russian ports in the north. Maybe they didn't garrison everything. Oh no, they didn't get Spain. That's the big deal. Yeah, you have to defeat Spain. That's important because you need the Spanish ports too. So yeah, getting yourself stuck in a position where you can't win Spain is a problem. But Spain is winnable. It just takes some care. You could fuck it up. And it's not just winnable. There's not much the Brits could do to help. Especially if they're at war with the Americans. It would have been interesting to see if British troops could have helped them. One of the problems with that is, though, Spain, under the French, takes Portugal, which is trivial to take, and strips that advantage away of a place where Britain can kind of operate out of and support the Spaniards. Anyway, I feel like this goes some way with the scripting and whatnot to make something that is a more playable game. Overall, I miss having the freer alliances that maybe create ahistorical situations in Empires in Arms. Empires in Arms is kind of like Cataclysm. It's, sort of a, yeah, this could have happened, maybe, sort of, kind of. But tends to generate very ahistorical situations this game tries to generate the coalitions that formed properly. I just am not convinced it's a balanced game. I really think the French have the huge advantage and should be able to win every campaign. That was the case in the old rules. They didn't even have to invade anything or conquer anything. All they had to do was hold Paris to the end of the game. I found the mechanisms of the movement and supply and whatnot tedious and just too much effort for sort of the fun level payoff. Even if maybe the battles are believable, even if I don't know, there were times when it just felt like I'm looking at, you're just funneling troops up all the time, taking losses, funneling troops. And it is really tedious. I don't buy the objection that some people have put that it feels more like World War I than Napoleonic warfare. But I'm not really sure that it really feels like Napoleonic warfare either. Some of that may just be the abstraction and the scale. But the thing is, like, there's greater abstraction in the area control game, in the area-based games. But this feels like it's showing more detail that just doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't feel terribly right, you know? It doesn't feel like when I set up one of the Zucker operationals and I'm trying to cope with the maneuvering and placement of units there. It just, the scale and whatnot just doesn't feel appropriate for what the game's trying to do. I think it needs to be a much, much bigger game with a lot more detail on the operational side. And, I mean, the original is kind of considered something of a classic, but I just kind of feel like nobody's really done the Napoleonic War right. I enjoy Age of Napoleon. It's very abstracted. I think turns are 2 years each. I've got to play it again before I talk about all of them. I love playing Empires in Arms, but it generates ahistorical type situations. But it's a blast. But yeah, it's really, I'm really having trouble finding one. Now, it's not as bad as like Revolutionary War that I'm like, God, there's just nothing that really works. But yeah, it's the original War and Peace though. This was one of my go-to sort of favorite. Oh, I want to do this. It's a big, long game. It's about a subject that I'm really interested about. But now it's feeling, dated and tedious to play to me. But I don't know. It's about it's about as good as anything else, in terms of the historical level it gives. I just feel like there's room for something better, there are plenty of nice light games out there. Napoleonic Wars is one of them. I really liked it until I saw how it has to be played to win, and then I'm like, wow, that's not historical feeling. Anyway, yeah, I don't know what to say. If you're into the sort of geometric, it's not even geometric because you're not dealing with zones and whatnot.
if you're into tediously moving your forces forward, maintaining long supply chains, and fighting out predictable and inconclusive battles to push the enemy back, this is the system for you. Yeah. All right. I'll send it up.